Chapter 17 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Chapter 17, 23 Days Against the Current. The next day the river was harder and steeper, and the banks offered more difficulties either for poling or dragging. From one side to the other we shifted, losing hundreds of yards in crossing as we swept down with the muddy current. And yet these crossings were never made until the last moment, when the poles could find no bottom and the steep bank came down like a cliff into from 15 to 50 feet of water. The little rapids that were nothing more than riffles coming down, that is, in comparison with the real canyons and rapids, were slowly poled and dragged through with double crews, inch by inch, around some jutting, strategic, rocky point and into the upstream eddy beyond. Boils of water burst from under the ballast until you balanced with the Lecos on the straining raft like rope dancers on the same strand. Once, and no one would suspect a clumsy-looking balsa of tippiness, an extra heavy boil of water burst under the balsa head and shot Agamemnon and the Lecos into the water. Fortunately, it was at the edge of an eddy, and no serious consequences resulted except that it kept the Lecos diving in 10 feet of opaque, muddy water for half an hour to recover a rifle. And it took half a day to get the rifle in shape again. That night, we reached Cam Libra, a rubber picker's shack, where was collected the rubber from a still further subdivided picket line of rubber pickers, and here we camped exhausted. The Retama was just ahead, and this could only be made if the river was below a certain stage. It was curious to watch the Lecos read every river sign. By this bush and that boulder they knew the height of water in any rapid above. Here in Cam Libra they announced that unless the river went down at least the span of a man's hand, 6 inches, it would not be possible to get through the Retama Canyon and rapids. That afternoon they shook their head against going on. The 6 inches made it impossible. By morning it would be lower, as they read the weather signs. A little stick was stuck in near shore to measure. In the dawn the river had risen 6 feet and was raging past the camp, carrying the usual collection of swirling dead driftwood and newly uprooted trees. Food was running low, for we had taken nothing from our main camp, as they would need it all before we could get back. The Lecos had a little rice that was giving out. Here and there we could get plantanos from a rubber hut along the river, but the main reliance was to be on the country between these points. The day before, a wild turkey, shot with a rifle for the shot cartridges swelled so that a shotgun was useless, was delicious but scanty. This day I took a balsa across the river to try for pig or parrot or turkey or monkey if we were lucky, or something anyway, for the Cam Libra place was vacant of planato or food except for the small family there. All day I tramped over the hardest kind of country with 4 of the Lecos, swinging down ledges by the jungle vines or wriggling through the masses of tangled growth in the trail of a Leco with a short machete. And as a result, nothing. Once there was a parrot motionless in the fork of a tree, high up and across an impassable gully, and not worthwhile. The river had dropped 2 feet and risen 3 later. All day it had been playing at this game, and the heavy clouds in the hills made the prospects discouraging. It was a scanty meal that night. After darkness had settled, a tropical downpour came up that showed no signs of abating. Steadily it poured until after daybreak, and all hands slept as best they might, soaked to the skin. The shelter tent was in a thin, widespread brook that the upper trenching did not stop or divert. As fast as one built a little protecting dam, it was washed away, and the bank poured a steady stream into the river, as from the eaves of a roof. And the river rose 10 feet in the night. It seemed impossible that we could ever get around the Retama, but there was not a half-day's rations left in camp. It seemed as if it was useless to wait for the river, and essential that we should get to the big baraka of Yispuri, where there were ample supplies for our party. There was no overland trail. It was through a jungle, 6, 10, 15 miles. You could take your choice of the Leco guesses. So with a couple of Lecos we started. The others were to try the canyon when they would, and reliance was well placed in them. There are no finer rivermen to be found anywhere in the world. The hunting of the day before had seemed hard going, but it was nothing to this. Up and down over gullies and waist deep in the tumbling brooks at their bottom, down sheer cliffs where the tropical vegetation grew so rank that a natural ladder would be formed by the tangle of interlaced roots or hanging mora, and skirting the face of ravines, clawing a hand and foothold step by step. I carried only a rifle, and twice I had to pass it to a Lekko, and then had no easy task left. As for the two Lekkos, they carried somewhere around a 50-pound pack each, and barefooted swung along among the vegetation as easily as might a couple of monkeys. Perhaps the river went down suddenly, though it is more likely that it was the removal of the diffidence that our presence entailed. At any rate, the Lekkos themselves pulled through that night and reached Yisperi with the balsas. For 13 days we were held in Yisperi, the river persistently refusing to lessen its height, while a succession of rains sent down a series of heavy freshets. It was not a dull time. A Lekko was held as a prisoner by the agent on a charge of attempted murder. I saw him as in the dusk of evening he sat in the doorway of his prison hut, taking the air. His wife and small boy sat with him and kept his legs muffled in an old poncho so that the heavy iron shackles riveted upon his ankles would not show. He was a fine-looking Lekko and obviously of enormous strength. It seems that another Lekko was found with his back cut to ribbons, apparently from one of the twisted bullwhips of that country, and with his breast beaten in. The victim lived, and this Lekko had disappeared. Presently he was captured and held in leg shackles, waiting for some indefinite arraignment. However, while we were at the baraka, he escaped, leg shackles and all, and was not heard of until some months later. He turned up below at our camp, and we became good friends. There was the gravest doubt as to his guilt. The Lekkos are most peaceful, and the whole affair was the result of a drunken fiesta of mixed breeds in which not one was fit to remembering anything. In addition, there was a serious fight among the Cholos, Lekkos, and rubber pickers one Sunday evening in which shots were fired, a dog killed, and a couple of men wounded slightly, while numerous others nursed unseen sore heads and bruises. An appeal for help was sent over the little creek that ran through the baraka, and the agent called on us. So our little party of 3 white men, a half-dozen of the more reliable employees, and the messenger splashed back through the darkness with our guns in our hands. In addition, my heart was in my mouth, and re-established order. It was a drunken fight over the favors of an old Lekko lady, a bleared old party of some 50 coquetting years. In one day, in the main shack, 2 snakes were killed, one in a room and the other in the kitchen, both of the deadly German flag species. Beautiful, slender reptiles they were, with broad bands of black broken at regular intervals with narrow bands of cream and vermilion stripes, and of exceeding venom. That same night, as I threw open my blanket preparatory to turning into a 3rd German flag, made a graceful letter S on the blue wool. Alarmed, he darted off through the cane walls into the next room, the storeroom. 2 successive rooms were emptied before the snake was at last killed. There was not a man in that place who would have gone to sleep with that snake in the place if it took all night to get him. Then, just as we were about to start, a young boy was brought in, half Lekko and half Cholo, the son of a man who had been murdered while working in his little yucca patch up across the Yapi River. He had been shot from behind through the stomach and had lain helpless until he died, although this boy, from his own account, was in the hut less than 100 feet away all the time. The boy, he was not 12, stuck to his story that he had heard no shot, nothing out of the ordinary. The chief agent in the baraka consulted with the Lekko crews who had brought him in. He did it, they responded. Make him tell. He was flogged with a knotted rope's end, and though he still clung to his palpably false story, and also he had been heard to make threats against the old man. After the flogging, he was locked up to face another later, unless he should have repented. Up here, in nicely civilized and sensitive surroundings, the flogging reads like the brutality of a savage tribe. It was revolting, and yet, what would you have done? The intendant would have had him flogged with a twisted bullwhip. Do you know what that is, or what that means? A twisted thong of rawhide, whose blow, drawn skillfully in the delivering, cuts a strip from the flesh, where 50 lashes, properly laid on, are equivalent to death. And to have turned him over to the legal authorities east of the Andes. They are there in name, but their functions are a joke. The best the boy could have hoped for would have been to march wearily day after day in leg shackles and chained to his guards, or to any other adult prisoner over the snows and blizzards of the high passes, and then to rot dully in a Bolivian jail. Probably he could not have undergone the rigors of the march, and lucky for him if he could not. As it was, he had the benefit of a civilized doubt and received only what the sentiment of his own people demanded. And he was not too old but what he could profit by it. By strict adherence to legalized forms, or those of them that would have been applied, he would have been killed by slow, indifferent inches. At last the river went down enough and we were off. We poled steadily along through an unending series of rapids, crossing from one side to the other through canyons, and losing in the crossing all and more of the hard-won ground. In one place in 3 hours we did not gain 100 yards, and then came the rains again. We barely made the farther side of the Yuyapi when the river laid siege. It rose 12 feet in the night, and held us 3 days in a little hut at the junction of the two rivers, raining for 2 of them. The agent at Guispuri had joined with us as he too was going out on business, and his balseros, combined with ours, made a very respectable expedition. The tiny hut was built by one man for himself, and into it each night crowded some 20 Indians. They held a dance, a queer, shuffling trot with dull, droning mumbles that passed among the Lecos as song, one night, and the next day they spent in celebrating the birthday of one of the crew. Cane platforms were built in the hut until there were 3 floors or tiers to the eaves, and on these we were all crowded sociably. Their shy diffidence gave way. They laughed and joked openly and with a childish innocence over any man being able to see out of glasses. They asked me questions of my home, my tribe, and my rivers, but the answers were Greek to them. They had no means of knowing the outside world. They answered my questions cheerfully through an interpreter each way, of course. They taught me to count in the Leco tongue, the Riki as they call their dialect. 1. Bera. 2. Twa. 3. Tsai. 4. Durai. 5. Bircha. 6. Burpakmo. 7. Toipakmo. 8. Saipakmo. 9. Burpella. 10. Burbuenque. 11. Beribuenque Burhote. 12. Beribuenque Toihote, etc., etc., etc. 20 is simply Toi Benke, and beyond this few Lecos could go with certainty, while some were at sea even up to this point. Yet they had no difficulty in actual counting. It was simply over names for the higher numbers that they stumbled. Once more we began the poling and dragging. This stretch of the river had given us no concern coming down, yet it was one of the hardest we encountered on the long pull up. One rock that jutted from the shore took my balsa an hour and a half to pass. Time and time again the vine parted, and my Leco and I were swept down with the current and around in the eddies, to repeat the process after we had paddled ashore and tried again. In another place we had to work the balsa up into the very spray from a cataract only 4 feet high, but over which the river poured in a thunderous volume, then cast loose with one mighty shove and paddle for the opposite bank, while in the meantime the balsa was being tossed in the bursting boils of water at the surface, or spun and dragged like a chip by the whirlpools that floated with the current. 3 times this swept my balsa half a mile below. Only one balsa made the crossing at the first try, and it looked more than once as though we would be upset for an uncertain swim. That night we made camp at Teaponte. Here a new cane shack had just had the triumphant finish to a palm thatch roof, and everyone in that little finca was already drunk. From somewhere we got 1 precious chicken for ourselves, and the Leco crews laid down to sleep, scarcely bothering the cook. They were so exhausted. It was the only time I ever saw any of them decline the opportunity for one of these festal drunks. Early the next morning we started. One more day that was a little easier, and for hours we pulled upstream against a gentle current along the bank and picked wild guavayas from the overhanging trees. It is a delicious fruit, although never since have I been able to find its kind, even in the cultivated tropics. This wild guayaba looked somewhat like a small gnarled quince on the outside. On the inside it had a most delicate pink pulp beyond a little rind. A delicious rind that combined the melting flavor of the strawberry with the texture and modifications of a superior watermelon. It was good. That night we landed in Guiana, 23 days of baffled progress against the same river and the same current that had flicked us down from this same Guiana in 2 days. End of chapter 17.